flash outside the off-stump. Episode 5. A Process of Civilization. After the excitement of their encounter with Surrey at the Oval, the Aborigines returned to Kent for a one-day match against the Moat Park Club at Maidstone. In contrast to the busy, brash, urban atmosphere of the Oval, Moat Park is set in quiet woodland inhabited by deer, and can accommodate nothing like the same number of spectators. However, what it lacked in quantity it made up for in quality, and it provided an excellent exercise in public relations for the tourists, as the home side was largely composed of aristocrats. The team lunched with 80 of the local gentry, including the noted cricket enthusiast and leading member of the MCC, the Marquis of Anglesey, to the musical accompaniment of 2 military bands. It was possibly Anglesey's recommendation that reversed an earlier decision of the MCC not to play the Aborigines, and which also ensured that when the fixture did take place, the MCC fielded a team which included an Earl, a Viscount and a Lieutenant Colonel. Also taking a lively interest in the Aborigines, but for non-cricketing reasons, was Lieutenant General Augustus Pitt Rivers, a Crimean War veteran and student of the history of warfare, attracted by the Aborigines' displays of spear and boomerang throwing, of which he made detailed observations in order to write a study of the evolution of throwing sticks. Pitt Rivers' interest in the subject led him to amass a collection of such objects, which was to eventually form the basis of the museum in Oxford which still bears his name.
When I can tell its sight a mouse a rifle from a javelin.
Geographically, the tour was broadly split into 3 parts. From their arrival in May until the 23rd of June, the team played 10 matches in London and the South East. From June the 26th until September the 15th, they toured the north of England, playing 25 further matches, mostly in the industrial towns and cities of Yorkshire and Lancashire, although they did also make visits to Swansea and Norwich on this leg of the tour. The last leg of the tour involved 12 more matches in London and the home counties between mid-September and mid-October. The poor weather and shorter daylight hours for this last section of the tour meant that they played to much smaller crowds, with some games proving to be loss-making ventures. Overall, the tour managed to make a profit of £1,000 or so, out of which it may have paid each of the Aborigines £50 on their return to Australia. It was hardly the fortune the promoters may have envisaged when they compared it with the money the All England 11 had made on their tour of the Antipodes. But it was not a disaster either, and provided the native players with a far better income than they would have earned for a year's work at home. Additionally, some of the players picked up considerable amounts of prize money from athletics, or by being the most effective cricketer in a match, and Muller, Cousins and Dickerdick were particularly successful. On the whole, English spectators had welcomed the Aborigines enthusiastically. Their standard of cricket was favourably commented on, and their displays of athletics and native sports proved, if anything, even more popular than their cricketing. Popular preconceptions of wild savages were regularly overturned by their standards of play on the field and their dignified and civilised behaviour off it. It is clear also that the drinking culture, which had been such a problem in New South Wales, when Wills had been associated with the team, had been brought under control. Heyman and Lawrence worked hard on the welfare of their team, and the players had heeded Captain Williams' warnings to them regarding drunkenness and how it would make them easy prey for the English criminal classes. There was one exception to this, when Tiger appears to have got separated from the rest of the team in Sheffield, and ended up charged with being drunk and disorderly after assaulting 2 police officers at 2 o'clock in the morning. Appearing in court with a bandaged head the following morning, he was given a caution and a £1 fine. Generally speaking, the Aborigines were feted off the field, and often found themselves invited into the houses of sympathetic families for tea. There were, however, some misconceptions about them. Lawrence later recalled an incident at a Brighton bathhouse.
I thought to give the blacks a bath before breakfast, and took them, with a great number of people following us. We could hear them saying they will never allow them in, as the dye will spoil the bath, thinking they were white men and just dyed for the occasion. This idea so impressed the ticket clerk that he would not give us tickets until he had washed and rubbed them with towels. This satisfied both him and the crowd, for they cheered them as they came out.
This isn't to say that there weren't unpleasant incidents too. The Newcastle Chronicle made a laboured and ill-advised joke about cannibalism. The landlord of the Bat and Ball in Gravesend charged extra for accommodation on the grounds that he needed to buy separate bedding for the savages, as he put it, and when the team played against Yorkshire, they were excluded from the luncheon tent. This last incident caused Johnny Muller to refuse to take any further part in the match and incensed both the spectators and the local press, with the York Herald observing,
"This untoward event was the cause of much criticism and many comments. That the sympathy of the public was with their darker brethren was unmistakably evident on the second day by the enthusiasm which seemed to pervade them. Cricket has hitherto owed much of its popularity as a national pastime to the perfect equality on which all who indulge in the game have met at the wickets, and it is a pity therefore that a breach of the good old custom should have taken place in the case of a team representing those under the same rule as ourselves at the Antipodes."
Two factors help with the general acceptance of the Aboriginal cricketers in England. Firstly, as alluded to by the York Herald, there was at this time a social convention that accepted that if somebody was well dressed, had good manners and spoke good English, then they were already 3/4 of the way to being a decent human being. Secondly, the American Civil War had created a great deal of sympathy for black people in England, and it was noticeable that, even in northern mill towns that had suffered economically as a result of the war, there was tremendous goodwill towards the team. However, there is also a sense in which the Aborigines had arrived in England just in time. In the decades following the tour, scientific racialism and social Darwinism began to stridently promote the idea that some races were naturally superior to others, with the influential anthropologist Walter Baldwin Spencer proclaiming that just as the platypus and kangaroo were more primitive than other mammals, so must the Aboriginal Australian be more primitive than other humans. Certainly, racial attitudes appear to have deteriorated 10 years later when the first white Australian team arrived at Lord's, and a spectator, thinking it was to be another Aboriginal side, referred to them as niggers. The press in 1868 may have facetiously and sometimes patronisingly referred to the tourists as sable, dusky or swarthy, but it never used that term. On the other hand, even when they were generally complimentary to the Aborigines, journalists couldn't restrain themselves from including unnecessary references to the Australians' colour, as in this report from the Rochdale Observer.
Play did not commence until near 1 o'clock on Thursday, but before that hour the black team put in an appearance, and their red shirts, white trousers and coloured sashes formed a pleasing contrast to their dark visages. They seemed generally stalwart men, and in their preliminary practice showed some fair hitting and bowling. Lawrence, the captain of the darkies, commenced with the first over. After dinner, the Australians handled the willow, but their batting, whether from ill luck or other circumstances, was very poor, only Lawrence making double figures. The fielding was very good, and the bowling of Messrs. Moore and Buckley most excellent, the latter's left-handers puzzling his dusky opponents.
But some parts of the press seemingly delighted in subverting any prejudices they detected, such as in this report of the game in Norwich.
It was hard to recognise the savage, by some supposed to be the most degraded in creation, beneath their gay scarlet shirts. However, degraded or not, they defeated the Carrow Club in one innings.
Towards the end of October, the team boarded the Dunbar Castle, a smaller sister ship of the Parramatta, for the return journey to Australia, arriving safely in Sydney on the 4th of February 1869. They still had a couple of fixtures to fulfil on their way home, drawing with New South Wales in a match cut short by torrential rain, and drawing with Victoria in a match on which the temperature topped 100 degrees on the first day, but was abandoned due to hail on the last. Public opinion was that they had improved beyond recognition during their year away. They played their last game together at Melbourne a few days later against a combined Army and Navy team, made up of officers from the Melbourne garrison and the crew of HMS Galatea, a frigate under the command of Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. A year previously, the Duke had enthusiastically intended their match against the Army and Navy in Sydney, promising to come and watch them play in England. Unfortunately, he had been unable to keep that promise because he was badly wounded in an assassination attempt shortly afterwards. But now they were able to finally play for him again. In a fitting finale to their career, they posted their best ever score of 331 for 9. In March they returned to Western Victoria, and in most cases obscurity. The Hamilton Spectator had some final words of praise, reporting that
the appearance of the darkies is, in every way, creditable to themselves and Mr. Heyman. They seem to have undergone a process of civilization which has changed their nature thoroughly, and their conduct would compare favourably with most white men.
Unfortunately, such sentiments would not save most of the team from poverty or an early death. From this time onwards, the Aboriginal inhabitants of Western Victoria were systematically removed from their homes and concentrated in government reserves, often far away from their places of origin, and often with other Aboriginal groups with which they had neither language nor culture in common. Many of the ex-cricketers and their families absconded from the reserves, though, and were quietly allowed to resettle on their original lands by the same sympathetic sheep farmers who had taught them cricket and sponsored them on their original trip to Melbourne. Cousins and Muller remained in Melbourne, where they were engaged as professionals by Melbourne Cricket Club for the 1869-70 season. Cousins' form deserted him, however, and he was released after a few months. A year later he was dead. Muller played better, but found life in the city was not to his taste, and he too returned home after a season in Melbourne. He went back to playing for Harrow Cricket Club on a regular basis, and his form was still good enough 10 years later that he was selected to play for Victoria against Lord Harris's touring England side. As such, he was the only member of the Aboriginal team to appear in an officially recognised first-class match. Lord Harris recalled him as a very elegant batsman, and an enthusiastic crowd presented Muller with £50 and a gold watch in appreciation of his career. Muller continued playing club cricket until 1890, when his health suddenly declined. He died in August 1891, the day after his 50th birthday. Most of his former teammates were already long dead. Throughout his long cricketing career, he had always stood up to racial prejudice whenever he had encountered it, and he had earned the respect of opponents and teammates alike. His funeral was well attended, and he was buried with his bat and some stumps. Not only did the townsfolk of Harrow provide a fine tombstone for him, but they renamed the town sports ground in his honour and put up a memorial to him there as well, also hanging his portrait in the Mechanics' Institute. It was a remarkable gesture in an age when, in much of the rest of Australia, racial conflict was still at its peak. Indeed, even while the tour in England was underway, the Pall Mall Gazette ran this story.
How savages are treated by civilised Englishmen. Our countrymen in Carpentaria appear to have no great difficulty in exterminating the natives without our assistance. According to the statement of a colonial paper, a party of Aborigines speared and cut steak from several horses. Upon this, the native police went forth under a European officer and shooting upwards of 30 blacks. While the battle was going, news arrived that a Mr. Cannon had been murdered. The same body of policemen started off, and very soon rounded up, as the reporter describes it, one mob of 14, another mob of 9, and a further mob of 8. In the latter lot there was one black who would not die after receiving 18 or 20 bullets, assuredly a very ill-regulated black. But a trooper speedily put an end to his existence by smashing his skull. The account concludes thus: everybody in the district is delighted with the wholesale slaughter dealt out by the native police. It is well that someone is satisfied with an exploit which looks very like indiscriminate and inhuman massacre.
Cricket had promised much for the Aborigines, and had briefly delivered. The tour to England had been successful but stressful, and, having only just broken even, there was little or no appetite to repeat the experience, either on the part of sponsors or players. Furthermore, the authorities had decided that Aborigines were becoming extinct, and that, while mixed-race children should be forcibly taken away and educated in the ways of the white man, full-blood natives should be isolated from Europeans as much as possible. Where cricket had previously been seen as a civilising influence, it was increasingly regarded as unsuitable for Aborigines by the people running settlements and missions, who were alarmed that proficient Aboriginal cricketers would be given opportunities both to travel and to access alcohol, both of which they deemed undesirable for Aboriginal welfare. They also felt that too much sporting success was wont to make natives proud and subversive, for if they discovered that they were better at cricket than the white man, might they not discover that they might also achieve equality or even superiority in other respects as well? So, despite their meteoric rise within the sport, the Aboriginal Cricket Tour eventually proved to be just a flash in the pan. Something of a false dawn in the journey towards genuinely racially inclusive sport. Indeed, despite its evident success, the tour was even used as an excuse to exclude a non-white player from a tour in later years. Crom Hendricks was South Africa's fastest bowler in the 1890s and took 4 wickets playing for his club against the touring England team in 1892. But although Hendricks was of Dutch descent through his father, his mother was from St Helena and he was classified as a Cape Malay. When South Africa picked their squad to tour England in 1894, the cricketing establishment were largely in favour of his inclusion, but it was vetoed by Cecil Rhodes, then Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Rhodes wanted a white-only team, but chose to hide his racism by disguising it as concern for Hendricks' welfare, claiming that he would be humiliated by English crowds calling for him to throw boomerangs in the interval. But for the men who took part in the 1868 tour, there was the satisfaction that they had at least contributed to a shift in opinion at home. On their way back to Edenhope after the English tour, they had played in Bendigo, and the local paper was fulsome in its praise.
It is somewhat astonishing that the Australian native should have taken to cricket as naturally as a duck takes to water, and have made such progress in the game in a short time as to wrest victory, in many cases, from white antagonists. It has been a popular prejudice that Australian Aboriginals were incapable of anything beyond hunting for opossums and eating grubs. Indeed, they have been set down by those who happen to be white, and have somehow obtained a reputation for being learned, as the lowest in the scale of humanity. But those who have had the opportunity of watching the sable cricketers have formed quite a different estimate of the race, and assert that they only require a favourable opportunity, and they would put to shame a large proportion of the white race.
After the Aboriginal tour, it was to be 18 years before another non-white team came to England. And in the next episode we'll be looking at how the Parsees reignited the flame that the Aborigines had all too briefly lit.